It started like any ordinary morning outside the federal courthouse. Two cops, a quiet black man on the steps, and a suspicion born from habit. But within minutes, the city would be talking about them. When the cuffs locked around his wrists, his eyes didn't show fear. They showed something colder, the calm of a man who knew the system had just arrested one of its own. The morning air around the federal courthouse carried a kind of weight that seemed older than the marble steps themselves. The sun had just slipped past the line of buildings across the street, throwing long shadows that stretched like watchful arms over the plaza. Lawyers with briefcases hurried down the steps, clerks tucked folders under their arms, and a swirl of conversations hummed in the crisp air. In the middle of this rush, Ethan Cole moved at a slower pace. His stride was steady, unhurried, almost detached from the urgency of the place. He wore a plain charcoal jacket that had seen better days, his shoes scuffed, his tie loosened. A black leather satchel hung from his shoulder, worn at the edges like a companion that had followed him through years of weather. To the casual eye, he looked like a man out of place among the polished suits and polished words. He wasn't dressed for prestige, not dressed to impress. He carried himself like someone who had no interest in explaining who he was or why he was here. He paused at the bottom of the wide steps, adjusting the strap of his satchel, then exhaled as if releasing a long-held thought. A man who had just left a hearing that mattered but wasn't his to talk about, someone who preferred silence to explanation. On the far side of the plaza, two uniformed officers leaned against the rail. They had been posted there all morning, watching the crowd thin out as the session ended. One of them, Officer Connolly, squinted toward Ethan. "You see that guy?" he muttered, nudging his partner with his elbow. Officer Miller followed his gaze. "Which one?" "The one with the old satchel. Dark jacket, standing like he owns the steps but doesn't belong here. Ever seen him before?" Miller shook his head slowly. "Nope. Doesn't look like the kind that comes out of federal court, more like the kind we pick up behind the bus station." Connolly let out a short, dry laugh. "Yeah. Something about him. Too calm, too comfortable. Folks who got nothing to hide don't usually carry themselves like that." Ethan adjusted his glasses, catching the faint reflection of the two men in the courthouse's glass doors. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. He had seen that look before, too many times. Suspicion without reason. Prejudice disguised as duty. He breathed deeply, keeping his expression soft, though inside his chest there was the weary tug of recognition. The older he got, the easier it became to spot when someone had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. The plaza had mostly cleared now, just a handful of journalists waiting for stragglers and a few clerks rushing toward parked cars. A man in an expensive suit passed close to Ethan, gave him one sweeping glance, then looked away as if dismissing him in the same breath. The dismissal wasn't new. It settled into Ethan like background noise, an echo he had learned to live with. From their post, the officers exchanged another look. Connolly straightened his jacket, lowering his voice, though there was no one close enough to overhear. "Let's have a word with him." Miller hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "You sure? He's just standing there." "Exactly," Connolly said. "Nobody just stands outside a federal courthouse with a bag like that unless they're waiting for trouble." Miller sighed, resigned. "All right, let's see what his story is." Ethan noticed their approach before they even stepped off the rail. He closed his eyes for a second, pressing his lips together as if steeling himself for a conversation he didn't want but already knew was inevitable. When he opened them again, his gaze was steady, fixed on the horizon beyond the street, not on the officers walking toward him. Connolly's boots clicked against the stone as he closed the distance. "Morning," he said, with a tone that carried more edge than courtesy. Ethan turned his head slowly. "Morning," he replied, his voice even, almost gentle. "Can we ask what you're doing here?" Connolly tilted his chin at the satchel. "Courthouse just let out. Everybody's moving along. You seem to be hanging back." Ethan kept his hands visible, resting them lightly on the strap of his satchel. "Just finished some business inside. Thought I'd take a moment before I go." Miller's eyes narrowed, flicking to the satchel and back again. "Business, huh? You a lawyer?" "No." "A clerk? Witness?" "No." Ethan's answers were calm but gave them nothing, no easy labels to place on him. Connolly crossed his arms, smirking faintly. Then what kind of business brings you here? Ethan tilted his head slightly, as though considering whether to dignify the question. He finally said, "The kind I don't need to explain standing on the steps." It was enough to irritate Connolly. He felt the balance of control slip, just a little. His hand shifted closer to the radio on his chest, more reflex than need. "You live around here?" Ethan gave the smallest of smiles, one that never reached his eyes. "I've been around." Miller glanced toward the street, noticing a few people slowing their steps to watch. A young reporter adjusted her camera strap, pretending not to listen. The air thickened, not with violence yet, but with that quiet tension when words might tilt into something heavier. Ethan adjusted his glasses again, watching the officers without flinching. Inside, his thoughts moved like water over stone. Don't let them bait you. Don't give them the satisfaction. He had seen the play before, knew every move. It was a tired game, but one that never stopped being dangerous. Connolly leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. "All right, let's make this simple. You got ID?" Ethan's hand stayed still, his voice steady as ever. "Am I under arrest?" The question hung in the air, heavy as a hammer. Miller shifted uncomfortably. Connolly's jaw tightened. Around them, the hum of the city carried on. But for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just 3 men standing at the foot of marble steps, 2 convinced of a suspicion they couldn't name, and 1 carrying the weight of having lived through this scene too many times before. Ethan exhaled quietly, looking past them to the distant line of traffic, as if measuring how far the day might go before the truth revealed itself. The plaza outside the courthouse never really goes quiet. Even when the doors close and the suits scatter, there's a murmur that hangs above the stone like heat in July. Footsteps, side conversations, the soft click of a camera lens. Ethan heard all of it while he watched the 2 officers square themselves in front of him, as if they'd been sent to guard a line nobody else could see. Connolly's chin lifted a half inch, the kind of small, practiced movement meant to establish height without inviting a fight. Miller hovered just off his shoulder, eyes flicking from the satchel to Ethan's face and back again, as if an answer might appear if he stared long enough. "Let's try this again," Connolly said, calmer now, but with that measured tone that pretends at patience. "I'm asking for your ID. You're outside a federal building, you're lingering, and the bag makes people nervous. The bag is old, not dangerous," Ethan said, "and I'm not lingering. I'm breathing." "You can breathe after we see some identification," Connolly replied. A gust of wind rolled across the steps, tugging at ties and flipping a few pages from a clerk's folder. A pair of attorneys slowed 10 yards away, their conversation trailing off while they took in the scene the way passersby stare at wreckage without admitting it. A woman with a press badge around her neck pretended to adjust her microphone, then angled herself so her phone's camera could catch a slice of the exchange. Ethan set his satchel on the top step and kept his hands visible. He wasn't going to give them a reason. "I'll ask a second time," he said evenly. "Am I being detained?" Miller's jaw worked. Connolly didn't blink. "We're conducting a lawful inquiry." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer you're getting." Ethan looked past them to the street, where the traffic light shifted from green to yellow, and nobody rushed for it. The moment stretched, a thin line of silence between 2 points of stubbornness. He could feel the attention settling on his shoulders, how the energy of a place changes when people decide a show is about to start. It always began this way, with a request that was really a test, with a tone that presumed guilt and made politeness sound like permission. A young man in a navy suit hesitated at the edge of the steps, a briefcase tucked under one arm, his tie just slightly off center. He looked familiar in the way the courthouse makes people, clean, pressed, weary at the eyes. He studied Ethan for a beat too long before looking away, but he didn't keep going. He stayed close enough to eavesdrop and far enough to claim he wasn't. His lips pressed together in a line of indecision. Connolly nodded once at the satchel. "What's in the bag?" "Papers," Ethan said. "Let's see them." "They're not yours to see." Connolly's mouth bent, either a smile that never arrived or something less friendly. "You're not making this easy." Ethan let the quiet settle again, the way you might let a cup rest on the table so the surface stops trembling. He could hear his own breathing now, slow and even, and the sound steadied him. "It shouldn't have to be easy," he said. "It should be fair." Miller tried a softer lane. "Look, sir, we're just doing our job. It's been a long morning. You know how it is around here. People get spooked. Help us help you." "That's a nice slogan," Ethan said, not unkindly. "But you haven't told me why you picked me out of this crowd." He tipped his head just enough to gesture behind them. Half a dozen people lingering, 2 with bags. Connolly didn't look, "and we're talking to you." The young man in the navy suit shifted his weight. He took a step forward, changed his mind, then took it back. A strand of hair slipped across his forehead, and he brushed it away, a small, nervous tell. The presswoman edged closer, microphone still pointed down, but phone raised just a little higher. Ethan reached slowly into his jacket, telegraphing every motion with a steady open palm, then stopped with his fingers on his wallet. "Before I hand this over," he said, "I want to be clear. I'm complying under protest." "Noted," Connolly said, though the words sounded like a door closing. Ethan passed him a driver's license. Connolly didn't bother to hide the way he looked at the photo, and then at the man, as if faces lie more often than names. He handed the card to Miller, who read the information under his breath, committing it to a memory trained to catalog the small facts that make up a person's official life. "Mr. Cole," Miller said, "what brought you here today?" Ethan's gaze stayed steady. "Business inside the courthouse." "What kind?" Connolly pressed. "The kind that's finished," Ethan answered. Connolly's patience thinned to a filament. "You think you're being clever? Because if you're trying to hide something—" "I'm not hiding," Ethan said. He picked up the satchel and moved it to the next step like a man reclaiming a small piece of ground. "I told you, I'm standing, I'm breathing, I'm deciding whether I want coffee before I drive out of downtown. That's all." "Why not say that to begin with?" Miller asked. "Because I don't owe anyone a justification to exist on a public step," Ethan replied, and for the first time there was an edge under his calm, thin as a paper cut, but it stung. A security guard from inside the courthouse pushed open one of the heavy doors, paused when he saw the knot of people, then let it swing shut again. 2 law clerks came out and skirted the edge of the gathering, their whispers like the rustle of leaves. The woman with the press badge finally lifted her microphone, adopting the neutral face reporters wear when they're both audience and witness. "Sir," Connolly said, "I'm asking one last time about the bag." Ethan looked down at the leather, the scuffs and creases like a map of another life. He could feel the path of this conversation tugging him forward, step by step, toward a place he had no intention of going. The old moves lined up in his head. Placate, explain, deflect, surrender, and he let each one pass by untouched. "The bag contains paperwork," he said. "Protected paperwork. That's all I'll say about it." Connolly's eyes sharpened at the word protected. "Protected how?" "By law," Ethan said. The young man in the navy suit flinched as if the word had nicked him. He took another half step forward, then stopped when Connolly's head snapped in his direction. "Can we help you?" Connolly asked, a warning wrapped in courtesy. The young man blinked, swallowed, shook his head. "No, sorry." He retreated 2 paces, but not far enough to leave. He looked at Ethan once, and there was something there, recognition, maybe, or guilt. It dissolved as quickly as it appeared. Miller handed back the license. "All right, Mr. Cole. If there's nothing illegal here, you've got nothing to worry about. But we're going to need to take a quick look inside that bag to be sure." "No," Ethan said, and his voice was velvet over iron. "Without probable cause or a warrant, you're not opening anything." Connolly spread his hands, palms up, as if to display the emptiness of his patience. "Probable cause is what I decide at the scene." "That's not how it works," Ethan said quietly. "You want to test that theory?" Connolly asked. The plaza seemed to lean in. A pigeon hopped closer, pecked at a crumb near the edge of the step, then fluttered off as a file folder snapped shut. The presswoman had stopped pretending to adjust anything. Her phone was filming now, the lens a small, unblinking eye. Ethan weighed his choices, counting them like rosary beads. He could escalate by refusing anything further, could put his fists in his pockets and his back against the rail and make them decide how far they were willing to go. He could comply with the search and give away the piece of himself he had kept safe through years of not being seen. A younger man might have chosen the fight out of principle. An older one knows principle is a poor shield if the other side comes loaded with pride and time. "I've given you my name and ID," he said. "You've got nothing that justifies a search. If you think otherwise, you can detain me and we'll sort it out properly in front of someone who knows the law." Connolly stared at him, the calculation plain, how it would look to walk away now, how it would feel to lose in front of a crowd he hadn't meant to gather. He shifted his stance, made a show of glancing at Miller as if delegating the next step, then returned his gaze to Ethan. "Turn around," he said. "Hands behind your back." A soft gasp rippled through the onlookers. The young man in the navy suit took another faltering step, the word wait dying on his lips before it fully formed. Ethan nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if to himself rather than to them. He raised his hands, crossed one wrist over the other, and paused. His eyes lifted to meet Connolly's and held there. "I am not resisting," he said. "I am not a threat. You're making a choice." Connolly's mouth tightened. The cuffs clicked like teeth. Miller spoke low, almost apologetic. "This doesn't have to get messy." "It already is," Ethan said, and exhaled. As Miller guided him a step to the side, Ethan's satchel thumped softly against his hip and then hung still. The woman with the press badge swallowed and raised her microphone without speaking. Somewhere behind them, a car horn tapped impatiently, and the city flowed on, indifferent. The young man in the navy suit pressed his lips together again, his eyes wet with the effort of doing nothing. Connolly reached for the satchel. Ethan turned his head just enough to see the officer's hand near the buckle and shook his head once, not in defiance but in warning. "If you open that bag right here," he said, measured and clear, "you will regret it." Connolly's hand hovered, then withdrew an inch, then hovered again. He wasn't afraid. He didn't do afraid. But something in the way Ethan said it, in the certainty that carried no heat, made him hesitate. He stepped back, nodded to Miller, and the two of them started down the steps with Ethan between them. The walk was short. The distance felt long. The marble, the camera, the whispers, they moved with the three men as if tethered by invisible wire. Ethan held his head level, hands bound, his breath steady in the cool morning. As they reached the bottom step, a shadow crossed their path. The courthouse door opening again, a figure stepping out into the light. Ethan didn't turn toward it. He kept his eyes on the street ahead and the strip of sky above the buildings, on the thin gold edge where the day brightened, and everything, for a fleeting second, looked like it might still turn. Daniel Reed had been walking fast, head down, the way men walk when they want to leave a courthouse and everything it holds behind them. He had a hearing to prepare for that afternoon, and his mind was already crowding with deadlines and arguments. But when he reached the bottom of the steps and heard the voice, a firm, even tone asking, "Am I under arrest?" he stopped. He knew that voice. Not the name, but the timbre, the kind of authority that doesn't come from loudness, but from having seen too much. Daniel looked up and saw the two officers closing in on the black man he'd noticed earlier, the one standing too still among the rush of people. He froze where he was, halfway between walking away and stepping forward. He could see the tension rising like static, the subtle shift of the officer's hand near his holster, the slow lift of the man's chin as he tried to hold his ground. The moment was small, quiet, but it carried that familiar weight Daniel had learned to recognize in this city, the kind that meant something bad was about to unfold, and no one wanted to be the one to stop it. Connolly's voice cut through the morning, sharp and clipped. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The man obeyed without resistance. Daniel's gut tightened as the cuffs clicked into place. He could almost hear his own conscience arguing with him. Say something. Do something. But the part of him that had survived in this building for 5 years knew how the system worked. Speaking up could mean headlines, questions, maybe even the end of a career. He'd seen it happen before. Good people flattened under bad moments because they tried to do what was right when no one else wanted the trouble. Still, he couldn't look away. The crowd had started to grow, drawn by the familiar magnetism of confrontation. Phones rose like silent witnesses. A few whispers slipped through. What'd he do? Did they find something? Probably a warrant. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew that tone, Casual, judgmental, the way people turn strangers into stories so they don't have to feel guilty watching. When the officer started leading the man down the steps, Daniel caught a glimpse of his face. There was no panic there, no pleading, just a tired calm, like someone who'd walked through this kind of storm before and learned not to waste breath shouting against it. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and Daniel felt something like recognition, though he couldn't say from where. The man's gaze was steady, not accusing, but it carried a question Daniel couldn't bear to answer. Connolly muttered something under his breath as he adjusted the cuffs. Miller kept glancing at the satchel still swinging from the man's shoulder, his curiosity eating through the thin layer of professionalism. Daniel wanted to step closer, to say that this was a mistake, but the words stayed lodged behind his teeth. His boss, Assistant District Attorney Grayson, was still up on the steps talking to a reporter, and Daniel could already imagine the conversation if he interfered. "You made it our problem, Reed. You didn't think before you acted." That voice, the one he'd heard too many times in his career, was enough to pin his feet to the ground. He shoved his hands into his pockets instead and watched as the officers stopped near the bottom of the stairs. The presswoman had started recording openly now. Her microphone trembled slightly in her grip. Daniel could see in her eyes that she didn't know what she was capturing yet, but she sensed it mattered. He envied her that certainty. A soft laugh floated from somewhere behind him, one of the junior attorneys he'd seen in court earlier. "Another protester, probably," the man said. "They never learn where they don't belong." His companion chuckled, and the sound made Daniel's stomach twist. He turned away before he said something he'd regret. When he faced the scene again, the man was speaking quietly to the officers. Daniel couldn't make out every word, just fragments. "I'm not resisting." "You're making a choice." The way he said it, without anger, without fear, hit Daniel harder than if he'd shouted. It was dignity turned into armor, hoping for someone else to step forward, a security guard, anyone, but everyone seemed content to watch. He took a half step toward them, then froze as Connolly's hand brushed against the satchel. The man spoke again, lower now, his voice like gravel rolling under the weight of truth. "If you open that bag right here, you will regret it." Something in Daniel stirred. Not fear exactly, but recognition of authority. An authority that didn't come from a badge or a courtroom. He'd met enough federal agents in his time to know that tone. The confidence wasn't bluff. It was knowledge. Training. He looked more closely now, noticing details he hadn't before. The small scar just below the man's ear. The way his shoes were worn from movement, but polished to discipline. The faint impression of a clipped badge shape pressing against the inside of his jacket pocket. Daniel's pulse quickened. He took another step forward before his rational mind caught up. What was he going to do? Walk into the middle of an arrest and announce a hunch? He imagined the fallout, the headlines, prosecutor interferes in police matter. He'd be suspended by morning, maybe worse. So he stayed where he was, silently watching as the officers led the man away, down toward the holding area inside. As the crowd began to scatter, Daniel lingered at the edge of the steps. His hands trembled slightly when he pulled out his phone. He didn't take pictures, didn't record. He just stared at the blank screen for a long moment before slipping it back into his pocket. His reflection in the dark glass looked older than it should have. Grayson's voice startled him from behind. "Reed, you coming? Or are you planning to get subpoenaed as a spectator?" Daniel turned, forcing a tight smile. "Coming, sir." Grayson adjusted his cufflinks, glancing toward the emptying plaza. "Always the same circus. Don't get too close to that mess. You can't save people from themselves." Daniel nodded automatically. "Yes, sir." But as he followed his boss toward the waiting car, he looked back one last time. Through the glass doors, he could see the officers disappearing into the corridor with the man between them. The sunlight caught the edge of the satchel just before the doors swung shut, and Daniel felt a weight settle in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Inside, he could still hear the faint echo of the man's voice. Steady, certain, unafraid. It followed him all the way down the steps, into the car, through the conversation he barely heard. It was the kind of voice that stayed with you long after the sound had faded, the kind that turned silence into something that accused you without saying a word. That evening, long after he'd gone home and changed into his worn flannel shirt, Daniel found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at the case notes he was supposed to review. He wasn't reading. His mind kept replaying the moment on the steps, the calmness, the cuffs, the way the man had looked right at him as if to ask, "Are you going to be like the rest of them?" He poured a glass of water, set it down, then picked it up again without drinking. He wanted to tell himself he'd had no choice, that it wasn't his place, that it would have made things worse, but the excuses felt paper thin against the memory of those steady eyes. Somewhere downtown, he knew the man was still in custody, being processed, questioned, misunderstood. And Daniel, for all his training and titles, had done nothing. The guilt felt too heavy for silence, but too dangerous for confession. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling where the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the empty apartment. He thought of what Grayson had said earlier, you can't save people from themselves. But that wasn't what this was, and Daniel knew it. It wasn't about saving anyone. It was about not being the kind of man who lets injustice walk past because it's inconvenient to stop it. He closed his eyes and saw again the moment the cuffs clicked shut, the brief flash of metal catching sunlight, and the quiet dignity of a man refusing to bow to it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When it did, it came in flashes, steel stairs, marble steps, and the same calm voice saying over and over, "You're making a choice." The steel cuffs bit against Ethan's wrists as the officers guided him back up the courthouse steps. The marble underfoot gleamed, polished to the point of blindness, and he could see his reflection in it. Head slightly bowed, shoulders straight, a man trying to look smaller without losing what was left of his dignity. The crowd that had gathered outside didn't disperse the way it should have. Instead, it grew. People love a scene, especially when it's someone else's humiliation. A few onlookers whispered, others raised their phones higher, and the air hummed with that mix of curiosity and judgment that always made Ethan's stomach turn. Officer Connolly had one hand firm on Ethan's arm, his jaw set tight, as if proving something invisible. "Keep walking," he muttered. "You're not helping yourself." "I didn't realize sitting on a bench was a crime," Ethan said quietly. Miller shifted on the other side, glancing at his partner with uncertainty. "Let's just get him inside," he murmured. The courthouse doors swung open, and a wave of cool air hit them. Inside, the hall was all echo, marble, brass, and the faint smell of coffee that had been brewed hours ago. The room seemed to freeze for a second when they entered. Lawyers paused mid-sentence, clerks stopped flipping through files. Ethan felt the eyes on him before he saw them. Rows of stares, some curious, some cold, some pretending not to look at all. At the far end of the lobby, a man in a crisp suit, Robert Gaines, a defense attorney who loved attention like air, watched with a half smile. "Well," Gaines said loudly enough for the echo to carry, "looks like justice works faster for some than others." Laughter followed him, brittle and mean. Connolly smirked. "You hear that? Even the lawyers agree." Ethan kept his voice calm. "Lawyers don't define justice. They just sell pieces of it." The remark hung there for a moment, sharp as glass. Gaines frowned, but Connolly laughed under his breath and tightened his grip, shoving Ethan a little too roughly toward the booking area. His satchel thumped against his side, and he caught a few murmurs from the watching crowd. "What'd he do? Who is he?" The same tired chorus every black man knows by heart. The officer stopped near a marble column, waiting for the clerk to open the processing room. Ethan could see the reflection of his own face in the polished brass sign beside him. He looked composed, almost detached, but inside, anger burned slow and quiet. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that calcifies over years. Connolly leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You know, you could have avoided all this if you just cooperated." "Cooperation isn't the same as surrender," Ethan replied. "That's a nice quote," Connolly sneered. "Maybe you'll have time to think about it in a holding cell." Across the hall, Daniel Reed appeared at the top of the stairs, briefcase in hand. He froze again, halfway between duty and guilt. From where he stood, he could see the cuffs, the officers, the amused faces of the lawyers gathered nearby. For a moment, he looked as if he might say something, but then he lowered his gaze and kept walking. Ethan caught the movement in his periphery, the flash of the same face that had hesitated earlier, the same silence. When the clerk arrived, she gestured toward the holding room. "We can use room 3, she said softly. "But officers, please, maybe don't bring him through the main hall. There's a hearing in progress." "We'll take the main way," Connolly said flatly. "He's not special." They started down the hall, passing a row of benches where defendants and families sat waiting. The scrape of their footsteps echoed off the walls, blending with the soft clicking of cameras. Ethan's cuffs clinked each time his arm shifted. Somewhere behind him, someone whispered, "They finally caught that guy from the news." Another voice corrected, "No, I think it's some protester." Both were wrong, but that didn't matter. In moments like these, the truth was never the point. As they neared the security station, Connolly's radio crackled. He ignored it. A young officer standing by the door watched the scene unfold, his mouth parting slightly. He couldn't have been more than 25, still wearing the look of someone who thought the badge made him a hero. "Sir, what's this about?" the young officer asked. Connolly waved him off. "Suspicious behavior, refusal to comply." "Outside the courthouse?" "Yeah, we're not making exceptions because of location." Ethan looked at the younger man and offered a faint smile. "You'll learn soon enough. Some places bring out the worst instincts." The younger officer frowned but said nothing. He just stepped aside. They reached the lower hall where the courtroom doors stood open. A jury had just been dismissed, and the jurors were spilling into the corridor, still talking about whatever case they just finished. Their chatter stopped when they saw Ethan, handcuffed, flanked by officers. The weight of their stares hit him like a wall. Among them stood a woman in a navy blazer, Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Price, her expression unreadable. She watched in silence as they passed, her eyes lingering on Ethan a moment longer than the rest. Something in that look told him she knew better. When they reached the center of the hall, Connolly suddenly stopped. "Wait here," he said to Miller. "I'll handle the paperwork." Ethan stood motionless, his wrists aching. He stared at the floor tiles, noticing how each one reflected a distorted fragment of his face. From across the hall, Gaines' voice rose again, smug and smooth. "You know what they say," he drawled to a colleague, "some men can't help inviting trouble. It's in their blood." Laughter again, louder this time. Miller shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't stop them. Ethan raised his head, meeting Gaines' eyes. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble. "Some men can't help showing who they really are." The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cuffs. A beat later, Connolly returned with a folder in hand. "All right, let's go," he said, grabbing Ethan's arm. But as he turned, someone new entered the hall, a woman in a black robe flanked by clerks. It was Judge Evelyn Harmon, known for her sharp eyes and sharper temper. She paused when she saw the scene, her gaze moving from Ethan to the officers, then to the gawking crowd. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with command. Connolly straightened. "Just processing a suspect, Your Honor." In full view of the public, her tone sliced through the air. "This is a courthouse, not a spectacle." Connolly stammered. "Ma'am, he refused to comply outside." The judge's gaze shifted to Ethan. For a fraction of a second, her expression changed, recognition flickering behind her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Ethan Cole," he said. The name hung there. The clerk beside her whispered something, eyes widening. The judge's lips pressed together, and she nodded once. "Officers, take him to a private room. Now." Connolly hesitated. "With respect, Your Honor." That wasn't a suggestion. For the first time all morning, the authority in the room shifted. Connolly's face flushed, but he obeyed. He led Ethan through the nearest door into a quieter corridor, away from the crowd. Miller followed, still silent. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed. The room was small, with a metal table and 2 chairs. Connolly pushed Ethan down into one of them and muttered, "You've got friends in high places, huh? We'll see how far that gets you." Ethan looked up at him, unblinking. "Farther than you think." Connolly opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the door creaked open again. A woman's voice from outside called, "Captain Graves is on her way down." Ethan didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of calm returning to its rightful place. Connolly frowned, unsure whether to feel nervous or defiant. Outside, the echo of heels against tile grew closer. Each step was deliberate, measured. Miller looked toward the door, uneasy. Ethan sat still, the steel still cold on his wrists, but his breathing even, steady. The sound stopped just outside. A shadow crossed the frosted glass window. And in that brief moment, before the door opened, the entire balance of power in the room seemed to change without a word. The door opened with a slow groan that seemed to drag every sound in the room along with it. Captain Linda Graves stepped inside, her posture straight, her face composed but tight with something unreadable. The kind of calm that comes from years of walking into bad situations and knowing exactly who's about to regret them. The fluorescent light glinted off the small FBI badge clipped to her blazer. Connolly's eyes caught it first, and he blinked, the color draining from his face for a split second before he masked it with a stiff nod. "Captain," he said, forcing authority into his tone. "Didn't know you were." She cut him off without raising her voice. "Clearly." Miller straightened beside him. "We were just bringing him in, ma'am. Suspicious behavior outside the courthouse." He refused to comply. Linda's gaze drifted past them, settling on Ethan. He sat still, hands cuffed, eyes calm but weary. There was no hint of panic in his expression, only a quiet, measured patience. She studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the officers. "You can take those cuffs off." Connolly hesitated. "Ma'am, we haven't finished processing." "Take them off." The authority in her tone left no space for argument. Connolly fumbled for the keys, the metallic click of the lock echoing in the small room. Ethan flexed his wrist slowly when the cuffs came off, the red marks stark against his skin. He rubbed them once, then looked up at her. "Thank you, Captain," he said evenly. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "We're going to talk about what the hell happened." Miller and Connolly exchanged a glance. Linda gestured toward the hallway. "Out." Connolly bristled. "With respect, ma'am, this was a lawful—" "It was a mistake," she interrupted. "And you're about 3 minutes away from making it worse. Wait outside." Connolly's jaw clenched, but he obeyed, slamming the door harder than he needed to as they left. When the sound faded, Linda turned back to Ethan. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space between them like a low, steady pulse. "You should have called ahead," she said finally. "I wasn't here on bureau business," Ethan replied. "At least not officially." She folded her arms, her gaze softening just a fraction. "You know how it looks. 2 local cops dragging an FBI agent through a federal courthouse? It's going to hit every news outlet in the city by the hour." Ethan leaned back in the chair, the metal creaking beneath him. "I didn't come here to make headlines. I was supposed to leave quietly." Linda studied him, the lines around her eyes deepening. "You still working that old case?" Ethan gave a small nod. "Loose ends. I thought that was done 2 years ago." "So did I." His tone carried the weight of something unfinished, something he didn't want to name. Linda let out a slow breath and rubbed her temples. "God, Ethan, you couldn't just wear the badge, could you? You had to walk around looking like some stranger off the street." He smiled faintly. "You know as well as I do, people talk different when they don't see a badge." "Yeah, and sometimes they put cuffs on you." Ethan didn't answer. He looked down at his wrists again, flexing his hands. The skin was already bruising. The sight of it brought back memories he didn't invite, flashes of a desert road, the sound of gunfire ricocheting off steel, and a man shouting for backup that never came. He blinked it away. Linda pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "You okay?" "I've been worse." "I remember worse," she said softly. "That op in Kandahar, you came back half dead." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth tightening. "That was a different kind of war." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You sure about that?" The silence stretched again. Ethan looked toward the window. The light filtering through the frosted glass turned everything a dull gray. "You ever think," he said quietly, "that no matter how many years pass, the battlefield just changes its coordinates?" Linda didn't answer right away. She followed his gaze to the glass, the shadow of the courthouse flag waving faintly beyond it. "Yeah," she said finally. "I think about that more than I'd like to admit." A knock broke the moment. The door opened a crack and a young clerk peeked in nervously. "Captain Graves? Judge Harmon asked for you. She wants an update about whatever this is." Linda nodded. "Tell her I'll be there in 5." The door shut again. She turned back to Ethan. You know they're going to bury this, right? The department, the courthouse, everyone involved. They'll call it a misunderstanding and move on. I'm not here for an apology, Ethan said. Then what the hell are you here for? He hesitated, then reached for his satchel, still sitting on the table. His fingers brushed over the worn leather before he unzipped it halfway. Linda leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. You planning to tell me what's in there? Or do I have to ask twice? Ethan's voice dropped, quiet but deliberate. Evidence. Not for this case, but another, something that connects a name on today's docket to a man who's been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Linda's eyes flickered with recognition. You're talking about Carson. Ethan nodded once. I thought he was dead. So did everyone else, until I found his signature on a sealed document last week. Linda leaned back slowly, letting that sink in. So you were here to make sure he didn't slip out again. Not just that, Ethan said, to see who'd help him do it. Her expression hardened. And you think someone inside this courthouse is dirty? I don't think, he said. I know. Linda let out a low whistle. Well, congratulations, you just turned a simple PR nightmare into a federal investigation. Ethan shrugged lightly. Wouldn't be the first time. Linda stood and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I'll talk to the judge. We'll clean up the mess outside before this spreads. But Ethan, she turned, meeting his eyes, you keep walking into fires like this, one of them's going to burn you down for good. He gave her a tired smile. Then I guess I'd better pick the ones worth burning for. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say more, but the weight of her duties pressed her lips shut. She opened the door and left. The sound of her heels faded down the hall until the hum of the lights reclaimed the room. Ethan sat in silence, staring at the satchel. His reflection shimmered faintly in the metal tabletop. Tired eyes, graying hair, a man who had learned to hide his weariness behind restraint. He unzipped the bag the rest of the way, revealing a small folder stamped confidential. Beneath it, tucked neatly between papers, was an old photo, his unit, 12 years ago. Sunlight, dust, faces half smiling in the aftermath of chaos. One of them was Carson. He traced the edge of the photo with a thumb, then slid it back inside. The hum of memory filled the quiet. The sand, the smoke, the radio crackle of a call that came too late. He remembered Carson's voice that night, calm as ever, saying, You can't tell the difference between enemies and allies anymore, can you? Now, sitting in a courthouse where justice was supposed to mean something, Ethan realized maybe that question had never stopped being true. He closed the satchel, leaned back in the chair, and waited for whatever would come through that door next. The corridor outside the small interrogation room hummed with low conversation and the muffled echo of footsteps. Ethan could hear every sound as if it pressed against the door, the rhythm of authority moving through marble halls, the slow mechanical churn of bureaucracy about to wake up to its own mistake. He sat alone at the metal table, the cuffs gone, but the mark of them still biting faintly into his skin. His satchel rested beside him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He closed his eyes and breathed in the sterile air. The faint scent of paper, coffee, and floor polish mingled with something older, the weight of judgment that clung to the walls of every courthouse he'd ever walked into. In another life, he might have felt safer here. Not today. Today, this place felt like a mirror of everything he'd spent years fighting. Assumptions, power, and the quiet cruelty of people too proud to admit they were wrong. The door opened, and Connolly stepped back in, his jaw tight, voice low. Captain Graves says you're free to go, but don't think this is over. We'll be filing a report. Ethan didn't move. You do that, he said evenly. Connolly stared at him, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. He'd expected defiance or maybe gratitude, something to let him reassert control. But Ethan gave him nothing. After a moment, Connolly turned sharply and left again, the door clicking shut behind him. Ethan sat a moment longer before standing. He adjusted his jacket, grabbed the satchel, and stepped into the hallway. The shift from isolation to noise was almost disorienting. The courthouse was alive again, phones ringing, papers shuffling, shoes tapping across tile. Conversations dropped when people saw him, then resumed with whispers once he passed. He kept walking, past the security desk, past the open courtroom doors where hearings had resumed. The faces blurred into one continuous stare, and then just ahead near the atrium, he saw Daniel Reed. The young prosecutor stood at the base of the stairs, clutching a folder too tightly, his expression somewhere between guilt and shame. When their eyes met, Daniel froze. Ethan approached slowly. "You were there," he said quietly. Daniel swallowed. "Yeah, his voice faltered. "I should have said something." "You should have?" Ethan agreed, but there was no heat in his tone. "Why didn't you?" Daniel looked down at his shoes. "Because I thought it wasn't my place. Because I was afraid of how it looked." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "And how does it look now?" Daniel let out a long breath, the truth weighing heavy on his shoulders. "Like I was a coward." Ethan nodded once. "Then maybe you've learned something worth more than saving face." He started to walk past, but Daniel caught his sleeve. "Who are you?" the younger man asked, his voice almost a whisper. "You're not just some guy sitting on a bench." Ethan paused. The question wasn't new, but it still carried the same ache each time. "I'm someone who's been watching this city forget what justice means," he said softly, "and I'm trying not to let it stay that way." Before Daniel could respond, a voice cut through the noise. "Agent Cole!" They both turned. Captain Graves was striding toward them, her expression unreadable, but her pace brisk. Several bystanders turned to look. The word agent seemed to hang in the air, rippling through the space like a shockwave. Daniel blinked. "Agent?" Ethan didn't look at him. "You should get back to work, Mr. Reed." Linda stopped beside them, glancing briefly at Daniel before lowering her voice. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan followed her without a word. She led him down a side corridor toward the main lobby, where the ceiling arched high and sunlight poured through the glass like a spotlight. The place was crowded again. Clerks, officers, attorneys, even a few reporters sniffing for stories. As they stepped into view, the room fell into that particular hush reserved for moments that feel like history in the making. Connolly and Miller stood near the security desk. They stiffened when they saw Linda and Ethan approach. The captain didn't slow down. "Officers," she said sharply, "you may want to pay close attention to what's about to happen." Connolly frowned. "Ma'am?" But he stopped when a group of men and women in dark suits appeared from the elevator. The lead among them, Assistant Director Rollins of the FBI's regional office, walked straight toward Ethan, his presence commanding without trying. He extended a hand. "Agent Cole," Rollins said, his voice carrying across the lobby. "Good to see you. We've been waiting upstairs." The room collectively froze. Connolly's mouth fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale under the harsh lights. Someone near the back gasped. The reporters lifted their phones higher. Ethan shook Rollins' hand firmly, the gesture quiet but final. "Had a little delay," Ethan said calmly. "Local misunderstanding." Rollins gave a dry smile. "I'll make sure that's corrected." He turned to Linda. "Captain Graves, thank you for handling this." "Trying to," she said, her tone cool. Rollins' gaze shifted to Connolly. "You're Officer Connolly, correct?" Connolly stammered. "Yes, sir." "Good. You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs within the hour." Connolly looked like he wanted to disappear. Miller stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Ethan watched them both, his face unreadable. Rollins motioned toward the elevator. "Let's go upstairs. The director wants a full report." As they turned to leave, the crowd parted. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, the same ones that had judged him an hour ago, now burning with curiosity and guilt. He didn't look back at them. He didn't need to. Inside the elevator, Rollins studied him. "You handled yourself well. Most men in your position would have pulled their badge the second it got ugly." Ethan gave a faint smile. "Most men haven't had to learn when silence is louder than shouting." Rollins nodded approvingly. "Still, it's not ideal for an undercover agent to end up in cuffs outside a courthouse." "I wasn't undercover," Ethan said. "I was on personal time, but it's all connected now." Rollins frowned. "Connected how?" Ethan glanced at the satchel in his hand. "Carson's file. It's bigger than we thought, and I'm starting to believe someone inside this building doesn't want it reopened." Rollins leaned back, expression darkening. "That's a hell of an accusation." "It's not an accusation." Ethan said, "It's a warning." The elevator doors slid open to the 5th floor. Ethan stepped out first, the steady rhythm of his shoes echoing through the corridor. The agents following him spoke in hushed tones, but he barely heard them. His thoughts had turned inward again, back to the moment outside, the crowd's laughter, the sharp click of handcuffs. The humiliation had been public, deliberate, but it hadn't broken him. It had reminded him why he still fought, why he stayed in this line of work long after he should have walked away. He reached a window at the end of the hallway and looked out over the city. The skyline shimmered under the noon sun. From this height, everything looked calm, orderly, fair. But he knew better. Below the glass, lives intersected in quiet wars, bias against dignity, power against truth, and most of them never made the news. Linda joined him a minute later, standing beside him without speaking. After a moment, she said, "You could have pulled rank and avoided all this." Ethan's gaze stayed on the city, and they would have walked away thinking they were right. This way, at least they had to see themselves. She let out a slow breath. "You're impossible." "Maybe," he said softly, "but I'm still standing." She smiled faintly. "For now." He finally turned toward her, the faintest glimmer of humor in his eyes. "That's usually long enough." Outside, the courthouse flag rippled in the wind, bright against the sky, untarnished by the mess below. Ethan watched it a moment longer before turning back toward the conference room, where the next battle waited. The laughter, the cuffs, the stares, they were already behind him. But the fight that mattered had only just begun. The hallway leading to the conference room felt heavier than it had an hour earlier, like the air itself had absorbed too many secrets. Ethan walked beside Captain Graves in silence, the soft click of her heels keeping rhythm with his slower, deliberate steps. Behind them, the two officers who had cuffed him were nowhere to be seen, pulled aside for debriefing, though both knew it was a polite way of saying interrogation. Ethan didn't pity them. There was a time he might have. But after years of watching men excuse cruelty as procedure, sympathy didn't come easy anymore. When they reached the end of the corridor, Linda stopped and turned toward him. "You sure you want to go through with this now?" she asked quietly. "You could walk out that door and let the Bureau handle it from here." Ethan's eyes flicked toward the frosted glass that led to the main hearing chamber. "And let everyone think this was just about an arrest gone wrong? No, this goes deeper." Linda studied him, her arms crossed, her expression caught somewhere between respect and worry. "You always have to carry the whole mountain, don't you?" "Someone has to," Ethan said, his voice calm but steady. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right, mountain man, let's go wake them up." Inside, the conference room was brighter than he expected. Sunlight poured through tall windows, striking the polished table at its center. A handful of people were already seated. Rawlins from the FBI, Judge Harmon, and a few senior clerks who looked as if they'd rather be anywhere else. At the far end of the room, Daniel Reed stood awkwardly near the wall, clutching a file, trying to look like he had a reason to be there. Judge Harmon was the first to speak. "Agent Cole," she said, her tone formal but warmer than it had been earlier that morning. "I'm glad to see you're all right. I owe you an apology for what happened downstairs." Ethan inclined his head. "You don't owe me one, Your Honor, but I hope you'll hold the right people accountable." She nodded gravely. "That's already in motion." Rawlins motioned toward the folder on the table. "Before we move on, Agent Cole, we need to clarify something. You mentioned earlier there was more at stake than a misunderstanding. You said this ties back to Carson." Ethan placed his satchel on the table, unzipped it, and slid a sealed envelope across to him. "That's the reason I was here today. Carson's not dead. He's been working through intermediaries, one of them on the payroll of this courthouse." The room went still. Linda's brow furrowed. "You're saying someone here's been helping him?" "More than helping," Ethan replied. "Shielding him. There's evidence in that file, a transaction log, signatures that match a clerk's access code, and communication between Carson and a name we all know." Rawlins opened the folder, his face tightening as he skimmed the documents. "Damn," he muttered. "You got this from—" "An informant," Ethan interrupted. "He's scared, but reliable. Carson's been buying silence, and today was supposed to be the day the last witness against him was quietly discredited in court." Judge Harmon's eyes widened. "You mean the witness in the McKinnon case?" Ethan nodded. "The same. The attempt wasn't physical. It was bureaucratic. Discredit her statement, bury the connection, and Carson's trail goes cold again." Daniel stepped forward hesitantly. I was assigned to that case, he said. But I didn't. No, Ethan said, cutting him off gently. You didn't know, but someone in your office did. Daniel's face paled. You think that's why those officers came after you? To scare you off before you could intervene? I think it was convenient timing, Ethan said, and maybe a reminder that prejudice can still do the dirty work for men who know how to use it. Linda crossed her arms. You're saying Carson's people planted the suspicion, counting on bias to finish the job? Exactly. Ethan's voice hardened. All they had to do was point the right men in my direction and let their instincts do the rest. The realization sank over the room like dust after a collapse. Even the clerks seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Harmon rubbed her forehead, then said, So what happens now? Ethan looked at Rollins. Now we expose it, quietly at first, then publicly if we have to. Rollins hesitated. That could mean putting you back in play. Ethan met his gaze without blinking. It wouldn't be the first time. There was a soft knock at the door. A young woman from security stepped in, holding a small tablet. Captain Graves, you might want to see this, she said, her voice uneasy. Linda took the device, her eyes narrowing as she scrolled through the screen. Oh, hell, she murmured. It's already online. Rollins frowned. What is? The video, she said. From the arrest outside. Someone posted it 30 minutes ago. She turned the tablet so they could see. The screen showed Ethan on the courthouse steps, the two officers flanking him, the cuffs glinting under the sun. The audio was clear. Connolly's barked orders, the crowd's laughter, Ethan's quiet voice saying, I am not resisting. Daniel winced. It's going viral. Of course it is, Ethan said softly, watching his own humiliation replayed in perfect clarity. That's what truth looks like when it finally escapes containment. Judge Harmon shook her head. This will cause outrage. Linda looked at Ethan. You could use this. You could make a statement, clear the record. No, Ethan said firmly. Not yet. Let it breathe first. People need to see it for what it is before they hear what I have to say. Rollins nodded slowly. You're playing the long game again. It's the only one that works, Ethan replied. The room fell into a thoughtful silence. Daniel sat down finally, setting his file aside. He looked up at Ethan with something close to admiration, or maybe relief. You're not just after Carson, are you? Ethan gave a faint, knowing smile. I'm after everything that lets men like him survive. Outside the window, the noise from the plaza had grown louder. Reporters shouting questions, car horns blaring. The storm had begun. Linda stepped closer to the glass, watching the commotion below. You realize this changes everything, she said quietly. It always does, Ethan replied. But sometimes that's the only way to fix what's broken. She turned back to him. You think you can take the hit again? I've taken worse, he said, his voice soft but steady. The truth costs what it costs. Rollins closed the file and stood. All right, we'll get a team on Carson. But Agent Cole, if you're right about someone inside the courthouse, this place is about to turn into a battlefield. Ethan adjusted his jacket and picked up his satchel. Then it's good I'm already dressed for war. Linda shook her head, half a smile breaking through her frustration. You're impossible, you know that? He looked at her, eyes tired but bright. Yeah, he said. But you keep showing up anyway. As they left the room, the murmurs from the crowd downstairs grew louder, rising like the tide. The truth was no longer contained in files or whispers. It was out there, alive, spreading faster than anyone could control. Ethan felt the pull of it, the familiar rush of purpose that came with danger. He walked beside Linda down the corridor, their footsteps steady against the noise. Two veterans of different wars marching toward another that neither had chosen, but both knew had to be fought. The courthouse lobby had become a storm of movement and noise by the time Ethan and Captain Graves reached the ground floor. The crowd outside had doubled, reporters pressed against the glass doors, camera flashes cutting through the sunlight like lightning. Officers tried to hold the line, but questions broke through anyway, shouted over each other. Is it true he's FBI? Why was he arrested? Is there a cover-up? The noise had a pulse, fast and relentless, the kind of chaos that feeds on its own energy. Ethan walked with measured calm, his face unreadable, while Linda's voice cut through the commotion. Everyone back! Give us space! She didn't yell, but her tone had the weight of authority that made even the reporters hesitate. They stepped aside just enough for the two of them to pass, leaving a narrow path through the marble floor. Every step Ethan took seemed to draw another flash, another question. He didn't respond, didn't even look up. Silence was his armor now. On the other side of the lobby, Rawlins waited with several agents, their dark suits standing out starkly against the light marble. The elevator doors opened behind them, and more agents spilled out, each one with a badge visible on their belt. The energy in the room shifted, that unspoken understanding that something bigger had arrived. Rawlins' voice carried clearly. "Officer Connolly, step forward." Connolly, who had been standing stiffly near the security desk, froze. His partner Miller glanced at him, face pale. Rawlins repeated the command. "Now, officer." Connolly straightened his uniform, forced his legs to move. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, eyes darting between the agents and the reporters filming everything through the glass. "Sir, Rawlins held up a hand. "Save it. You're being placed on administrative leave pending investigation. You and your partner will surrender your service weapons and badges immediately." The murmurs rippled through the onlookers like a wave. Connolly's voice cracked. "With all due respect, Director, I was following procedure." "No," Rawlins said sharply. "You were following bias, and in doing so, you assaulted a federal agent on assignment." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the camera shutters seemed to hesitate. Connolly blinked, confusion and disbelief flashing across his face. He looked to Linda, then to Ethan, searching for something, mercy maybe, or understanding. He found neither. "Federal agent?" he stammered. "Him?" Ethan turned toward him then, meeting his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "me." The crowd erupted again, voices overlapping, questions crashing together. Rawlins gestured to his agents, who moved quickly to block the noise. Linda stepped closer to Ethan, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something like pride in her eyes. The truth had arrived, not with a bang, but with the steady inevitability of a tide that couldn't be held back. Connolly shook his head, voice rising. "I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Ethan interrupted, his voice low but cutting through the noise. "You didn't know, and it shouldn't take a badge to make you treat a man with respect." Miller's face fell. He looked down at the floor, the weight of the words settling heavy on his shoulders. The security guards exchanged uneasy glances. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's FBI," and the phrase rippled outward until it filled the space, growing louder, repeated over and over like a mantra. Rawlins turned toward the gathered press. "This incident will be reviewed thoroughly," he said, his voice firm. "But let me be clear. Agent Cole was operating under federal authority on a classified matter. Any obstruction or interference with a federal agent will be treated accordingly." The reporters pushed forward, microphones raised. "Agent Cole, what were you doing here? Were you undercover? Do you plan to file charges against the officers?" Ethan said nothing. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and looked past the crowd to the doors beyond them, where the sunlight poured in bright and blinding. Linda stepped in front of him, blocking the path of a camera. "No further questions," she said firmly. "Agent Cole has no statement at this time." She turned to Rawlins. "Get him upstairs, now." Rawlins nodded to two nearby agents who cleared a path toward the elevator. As they moved, a few of the courthouse employees pressed back against the walls, whispering among themselves. The expressions varied: shock, shame, disbelief, but not one person stepped forward to apologize. Ethan had stopped expecting that long ago. Halfway across the lobby, a familiar voice called out, "Agent Cole!" Ethan turned. Daniel Reed was standing at the base of the staircase, looking nervous but determined. He clutched a folder to his chest, the same one he'd been holding earlier. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise faded into the background. "Don't let them spin this," Daniel said, his voice loud enough to carry. "People need to know what really happened." Ethan studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. "The truth doesn't need help, Daniel. It just needs time." Daniel looked down, unsure how to respond, but there was relief in his eyes, like a man who'd finally stepped onto the right side of the line. As Ethan reached the elevator, he glanced back one last time. Connolly stood surrounded by his peers, head bowed, his badge lying on the counter beside him. It gleamed under the light, bright, hollow, and suddenly meaningless. Inside the elevator, the doors slid shut with a quiet finality. The noise from the lobby was cut off. replaced by the hum of machinery and the faint pulse of Ethan's heartbeat in his ears. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the last few hours settle. Linda stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the numbers climbing above the door. "You handled that better than I would have," she said. Ethan gave a faint smile. "You'd have broken his nose." She didn't deny it. "I still might." He chuckled softly, but the sound faded quickly. "That video's out now. The story won't stop here." "I know," Linda said, "and neither will Carson's people. You think this exposure helps your case?" "Not mine," Ethan said quietly, "but it helps theirs, the people who can't fight back. Maybe someone watching that clip will think twice next time before assuming who the threat is." Linda's voice softened. "You really believe that?" "I have to," he said. "Otherwise, none of this is worth it." The elevator chimed. The doors opened onto the 5th floor, where Rollins waited with a few agents near the briefing room. He nodded once to Ethan. "They're ready for you." As Ethan stepped out, he paused at the window overlooking the plaza below. From up here, the chaos looked small, almost peaceful. But he knew better. The story would spread by nightfall, across screens, through headlines, over dinner tables. Some would rage, others would reflect. But one thing was certain. No one would see the world exactly the same way tomorrow. He turned away from the window and followed Rollins down the corridor. "Let's finish this," he said. Linda fell into step beside him. "You sure you're ready for another round?" Ethan's voice was calm, resolute. "I've been ready my whole life." The doors closed behind them, leaving only the echo of their footsteps in the empty hall. Outside, the crowd's voices rose again, a chorus of noise and light. The truth had finally broken free, and there was no putting it back. The conference room felt different now, less like a meeting place and more like a courtroom without a bench. The blinds were drawn halfway, slicing the afternoon light into thin golden bars that fell across the table. Ethan stood at one end, still as stone, while a half-dozen people watched him from the other side. Rollins leaned against the window with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Linda sat near the center, fingers tapping lightly against a notepad she hadn't written on. And across from her sat the two officers, Connolly and Miller, both in plain clothes now, stripped of their badges and the swagger that came with them. Their faces looked smaller without the uniforms. Rollins broke the silence first. "Let's keep this simple. We're here to close the loop on what happened today. No cameras, no press, no excuses." He turned to Ethan. "Agent Cole, the floor is yours." Ethan didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady, carrying the kind of calm that made people lean in. "I'm not here for revenge," he said, "if that's what anyone's worried about." Connolly shifted in his seat. "Good to hear," he muttered, but Linda shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass, and he fell silent. Ethan set his satchel on the table, resting one hand on it like an anchor. "What happened this morning wasn't just about me," he continued. "You thought you saw a threat, and maybe for a split second you believed it, but you didn't see a threat. You saw a color. You saw a story you've told yourself so many times it's become instinct." Connolly looked away, his throat working. Miller's eyes flicked toward the floor. Ethan watched them both, not with anger, but with a kind of weary clarity. "You've been trained to react. I understand that. But what happens when your training doesn't leave room for truth? What happens when the law you serve becomes smaller than the bias you carry?" No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air vent and the slow ticking of a clock mounted near the door. Ethan looked down briefly, then back up. "You asked me outside if I was hiding something," he said. "And you were right. I was. Not because I wanted to deceive anyone, but because the job required it. But here's the thing. You never asked why a man might need to hide who he is just to be treated like a person." Connolly swallowed hard, the words hitting somewhere he couldn't deflect. "I didn't know you were FBI," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. Ethan nodded once. "And it shouldn't have mattered." The room seemed to contract around that sentence. Linda's pen stopped tapping. Rollins pushed off the wall and came closer, arms still folded. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "If I hadn't been FBI, I'd still have been a man reading on a bench. You would have cuffed me just the same. The only difference is today you got caught." Miller opened his mouth, then shut it again. He looked at Connolly, who gave him a slight shake of the head. Linda leaned forward, her tone measured but heavy. Agent Cole's right. What happened outside wasn't about procedure, it was about perception. And perception, gentlemen, is where justice either lives or dies. Connolly shifted again, his fingers clenching. You think I'm proud of what happened? You think I don't know how it looks? Ethan studied him for a long moment. You can't change how it looks, he said quietly, but you can change what you do next. For a second, the words hung there, fragile but solid, like a bridge built between them. Connolly nodded slowly, the weight of it settling into his face. I made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A bad one. Ethan gave a small nod. Mistakes teach you something, if you're willing to learn. Rollins cleared his throat, stepping in to break the tension. For the record, he said, the department will handle disciplinary measures internally, but this conversation stays between us. No leaks. The Bureau doesn't need another headline. Ethan turned toward him. It's not the headlines that bother me, sir. It's the silence after they fade. Rollins studied him, then gave a slow nod. Understood. Linda leaned back, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You done making speeches, Ethan? He smiled faintly. You know me better than that. She almost smiled back. Unfortunately, yes. Ethan looked toward the officers again, his tone softening. You both have a choice now, he said. You can treat this as a bad day and forget it, or you can let it change how you see the world. Neither man answered, but something in their expressions shifted. A quiet recognition, not yet redemption, but the start of it. Ethan picked up his satchel and turned toward the door. Before he could leave, Rollins spoke again. One more thing, Agent Cole. The director wants to commend you for handling this without escalation. That kind of restraint. Ethan stopped him gently. Wasn't restraint, he said. It was exhaustion. Rollins frowned. Exhaustion? Ethan turned slightly, the light from the window catching the edge of his face. You get tired of proving you belong in places you've already earned. You get tired of having to be the calm one in every storm. But you do it anyway, because if you lose your temper, you lose everything else too. The words landed heavier than anyone expected. Even Linda went still. Rollins opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing there was nothing to add. Ethan nodded once more, then pushed open the door. Outside, the noise of the courthouse came flooding back, the echo of voices, the shuffle of papers, the distant hum of the city pressing in. The light seemed brighter now, too bright after the muted gray of the conference room. As he stepped into the hallway, Linda followed. You sure you don't want to stick around for the official apology? She asked. He glanced at her. An apology isn't justice. No, she said. But it's a start. Maybe, he said. But real justice comes when they stop seeing people like me as a start. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Through the glass doors ahead, Ethan could see the plaza, still buzzing with reporters. The same crowd that had watched him humiliated now waited for a sound bite, a statement, a performance. He wasn't going to give them one. He stopped near the entrance, turning back to Linda. Do me a favor, he said. Keep them off the Carson file until I've finished my end. There's more here than anyone wants to admit. She frowned. You're not thinking of going rogue again, are you? He gave her a small, tired smile. Rogue's just another word for early. She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the faint smirk. You'll never change. Wouldn't know how, he said. The door opened automatically as he stepped forward. The noise of the plaza rushed in, the flashes already starting again. But this time, Ethan didn't flinch. He paused on the top step, sunlight warming the back of his neck, and turned to look once more at the building behind him, a place that held both justice and its failures under the same roof. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and started down the stairs, the sound of cameras chasing him like rain. Behind him, through the open doors, Linda's voice carried faintly. You did good, Ethan, she called. He didn't turn back, but his answer drifted through the air as he disappeared into the crowd. Not yet. The next morning, the city woke up with his name on its lips. Every local station ran the same footage, the cuffs, the confusion, the quiet dignity that followed. Talk show hosts dissected it like it was breaking news from a foreign war. Some called him a hero. Others said he'd baited the officers. But for most people watching, The shock wasn't that a black man had been arrested without cause. It was that the man turned out to be one of them, an FBI agent. The irony made it easy to watch, easy to talk about, easy to forget that it was just another version of the same story. Ethan didn't turn on the TV that morning. He sat by his window instead, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the gray light roll across the buildings outside. His phone buzzed every few minutes. Messages from colleagues, press requests, an apology drafted by the Bureau's PR team that he hadn't approved. The words were polished, meaningless. They read like they'd been written to soothe the public, not the wound. When the knock came at his door, he already knew who it was. Daniel Reed stood in the hallway, suit slightly wrinkled, face drawn from lack of sleep. He held 2 cups of coffee from the corner cafe. "I didn't know how you take it," he said, lifting the second cup like an offering. Ethan nodded, letting him in. "You came early." "Couldn't sleep," Daniel admitted. "Couldn't stop seeing it. That look on your face when they—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted softly. "It's done." Daniel set the coffee down on the table, hesitating before sitting. "It's not done. They're talking about it everywhere. You've seen the clips. There's thousands of comments. Half the city's ready to hang those cops. The other half's defending them." Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. "That's America for you. We can split a tragedy into 2 teams before lunch." Daniel looked at him carefully. "You don't sound angry." "I'm tired," Ethan said simply. "Anger burns fast. Fatigue lasts longer." They sat in silence for a while, the distant hum of traffic filling the space. Daniel shifted in his chair, then said, "I came because I owe you an apology. I could have stopped it before it happened. I could have said something when I saw them walk toward you. I didn't." Ethan looked at him for a long time before answering. "You were afraid." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." "You're not the first," Ethan said. "And you won't be the last. Fear's cheap around here. You can buy it by the pound." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "I'm trying to change that." "Then start by not hiding behind your silence next time," Ethan said. "Justice doesn't need more quiet men." Daniel nodded again, and something in his posture loosened, like a man who'd finally admitted to his own reflection. He stood. "You think they'll really face consequences?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window again. "Consequences come in 2 kinds," he said finally. "The ones the system gives you and the ones you give yourself. The first can be dodged. The second can't." When Daniel left, the apartment felt heavier somehow. Ethan finished his coffee and finally turned on the television. The screen flashed images of him walking out of the courthouse, followed by commentary about perception and implicit bias. They used words like incident, misunderstanding, and unfortunate optics. Not one of them called it what it was. By afternoon, he was back at the precinct, standing in front of the disciplinary hearing. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the way every government room does when it's trying to smell like justice. Connolly and Miller sat at one end of the table, both in civilian clothes, both visibly smaller than they'd been the day before. Captain Graves sat in the middle, her expression firm but fair. Ethan stood near the back, leaning against the wall, not part of the process but unwilling to leave it unfinished. The hearing was formal, methodical, questions, answers, official phrasing that made ugly things sound manageable. Connolly's voice was steady at first, but by the time he reached the part where he described the initial approach, it started to waver. He glanced toward Ethan, then away. "I made assumptions," he admitted. "Ones I shouldn't have made." The room stayed silent. Graves didn't flinch, didn't comfort him. "Those assumptions almost cost you your badge," she said, "and they could have cost a man his life." Miller shifted beside him, clearing his throat. "We didn't know who he was." Ethan's voice broke the silence. "You still don't," he said quietly. Every head turned. Graves didn't stop him. Ethan stepped forward. "You saw what you wanted to see," he continued. "And you acted like that made it true. You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. The badge isn't what should have stopped you. Humanity should have." Connolly's shoulders sagged. "You're right," he said softly. "It won't happen again." Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "I hope that's true," he said, "because the next man you meet might not be wearing a badge under his jacket. He might not survive the mistake." The room stayed quiet long after he'd finished speaking. Graves finally cleared her throat. "That'll be all, Agent Cole." He nodded once and turned to leave. As he stepped into the hallway, the sound of Connolly's voice drifted faintly behind him, low, shaken, almost human again. Maybe that was enough. Outside, the afternoon sun was blinding. The press was gone, the plaza mostly empty, except for a janitor sweeping the marble steps where it all began. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking at the spot where he'd been forced to his knees just a day before. It felt like another lifetime. Linda joined him a few minutes later, her hands in her coat pockets. "He's suspended," she said, "pending review." "Doesn't matter," Ethan said. "They'll move him to another district, give him sensitivity training. Call it reform. The system takes care of its own." She nodded slowly. "Maybe, but sometimes change starts small." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth turning up just slightly. "You ever seen a mountain move because someone pushed it?" "No," she said, "but I've seen it erode over time." They stood in silence after that, the breeze rustling through the flags above them. The courthouse loomed behind them, tall and unyielding. Ethan adjusted the strap of his satchel. "You think people will remember this?" "Some will," she said. "Most won't, but the right ones will." He nodded. "That's all that ever matters." Linda turned toward him, studying his face. "You could walk away, you know, take leave. You've done enough." Ethan's eyes followed a pigeon circling high above the plaza. "I'll walk away when the noise quiets down," he said. "Not before." She sighed, shaking her head. "You don't even know how to stop, do you?" "Stopping's easy," he said. "Living with why you stopped isn't." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the marble. For a moment, everything was still. The city, the courthouse, even the air itself. Ethan turned toward the street, ready to leave it behind, but paused when he heard the faint echo of laughter from a passing group of tourists. None of them recognized him. None of them knew what had happened here. And somehow, that anonymity felt like freedom. He walked down the steps slowly, each one lighter than the last. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed with a quiet, hollow sound. Ahead, the city stretched open, indifferent and alive. He blended into it easily. Another man in a sea of faces, his figure swallowed by sunlight and motion. And for the first time since the cuffs had locked around his wrists, he felt the air in his lungs move freely again. The city didn't rest after the video. It spread faster than the truth ever could, slipping through phones and news cycles until every conversation in town seemed to orbit the same 30 seconds of footage. 2 officers, 1 man in cuffs, 1 calm voice saying, "I am not resisting." The images looped endlessly, stripped of context, inflated with commentary. Talk shows debated it, politicians issued statements, and every network promised a special report on racial profiling and law enforcement accountability. For Ethan, it was all just noise, too loud, too late. He kept his head down for a few days, working quietly at the Bureau's downtown office. There were new faces in the halls now, internal affairs investigators, media liaisons, even a few politicians looking to borrow the Bureau's credibility. Every time Ethan walked past, their conversations slowed, eyes following him like he carried something radioactive. He'd been through this before. Heroes made by circumstance, forgotten once the headlines moved on. Linda Graves found him in the break room on a Thursday morning, sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "You're supposed to be at the press briefing," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look up. "I'm not in the mood to be anyone's symbol." "It's not optional," she said. "The director wants you there. Public trust, transparency, all that." He let out a dry laugh. Public trust, right? He stood, brushing off his jacket. They'll spin it either way. When they arrived at the briefing, the air was thick with tension. Rows of cameras faced the podium, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. The room buzzed with whispered questions, the low hum of anticipation that comes before someone says something that might make history or headlines. The director spoke first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "The Bureau stands by Agent Cole. What happened was an unfortunate lapse in judgment by local law enforcement. We are cooperating fully to ensure accountability." Ethan stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back, face composed. When the director motioned for him to speak, he stepped forward slowly. The flashes were blinding. For a moment, he just looked at the sea of faces staring up at him, searching for something. Anger, forgiveness, explanation. "I've been asked what justice looks like," he began. His voice was quiet, but the microphones carried it easily. For me, it's not about punishment. It's about recognition. Recognition that what happened to me happens every day to people who don't have a badge, who don't have the bureau behind them. They don't get a press conference. They don't get headlines. Most of them don't even get believed. The room went still. No one moved. No one spoke. He let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. This isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern. And patterns don't change just because one man gets an apology. They change when we stop pretending these moments are accidents. He stepped back from the podium without another word. Reporters shouted questions, flashes erupted again, but he kept walking until he reached the corridor behind the stage. Linda was waiting for him, a look of mixed pride and worry in her eyes. "That wasn't the speech the director approved," she said quietly. He gave her a faint smile. "No, but it's the one that needed to be heard." Later that night, he sat in his apartment again, lights dim, the city outside humming like a restless animal. The video still played on the news, but now his speech was added to the loop. It wasn't about the arrest anymore, it was about the message. Protesters had gathered downtown, holding signs that read, "It shouldn't take a badge." Someone had even printed his words on posters. It felt surreal, almost wrong. He hadn't meant to become a movement. He just wanted to hold a mirror up and make people look. The phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He ignored it. A moment later, it buzzed again. Same number. He sighed and answered. "Cole." A low voice on the other end said, "You made a lot of noise, Agent." Ethan straightened slightly. "Carson." "You always were predictable," the voice said, a hint of amusement beneath its calm. "Still playing the hero, still pretending the system you work for isn't the same one that broke you." Ethan walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "You're still hiding behind phones and ghosts." "I don't hide," Carson replied. "I adapt. And you? You just painted a target on yourself." "Then come find me," Ethan said. A soft laugh echoed through the receiver before the line went dead. Ethan stood there, staring out at the night. His reflection in the glass looked tired but unshaken. The past he tried to bury had found him again, right on schedule. The next morning, the Bureau's headquarters was surrounded by reporters. Ethan moved through them quietly, ignoring the shouted questions, the microphones thrust into his path. Inside, he found Linda waiting with 2 cups of coffee. "He called, didn't he?" she said. Ethan didn't answer. She sighed. "I had a feeling. Carson never could stand staying buried." "He's back in play," Ethan said. "The leak we found wasn't random. He's using the chaos to move again." Linda frowned. "You realize that means everything that happened this week, the arrest, the press, the attention, it's all smoke for something bigger." "I know," Ethan said, "and that's why we have to move fast." "You're not cleared for field work," she reminded him. "They'll never sign off on it." He picked up the file from her desk, the Carson dossier, edges worn from too many hands. "Then I'll go without it." Linda stepped in front of him. "Ethan, don't do this. You've already been through hell. Let the Bureau handle it." He met her eyes, calm and unyielding. "The Bureau doesn't know him like I do." For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but the words never came. She just nodded slowly. "You've got 48 hours before Rollins notices you're gone. After that, I can't cover for you." Ethan smiled faintly. 48's more than I need." That night, as he drove through the city, the streets blurred by rain, the radio crackled with updates about protests and policy meetings. The world had already moved on to the next phase: debate, reform, damage control. But Ethan wasn't done. The real story wasn't on the steps of the courthouse or in the news feeds. It was hidden behind the same old curtain of corruption that Carson had been part of. The only difference now was that Ethan had nothing left to lose. He parked near the edge of the river, the skyline reflected in the black water. For a long time, he sat there in silence, the sound of rain against the windshield, like the ticking of a slow clock. Somewhere out there, Carson was watching, waiting. The city that had humiliated him now needed him again, though it would never admit it. Ethan reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his old service pistol, the metal cold and familiar in his hand. He checked the chamber, then slid it back into the holster beneath his jacket. The fight wasn't over. It never was. He just stopped pretending otherwise. When he stepped out of the car, the rain caught the streetlights in soft halos around him. The courthouse loomed in the distance, tall, silent, unrepentant. He started walking toward it, every step steady, every breath even. The noise of the world faded behind him. There was work to finish, truth to dig up, and ghosts to confront. The storm had only just begun. The courthouse felt different the day the city came to listen. The plaza was quieter than it had been on the morning of the arrest, not because fewer people had gathered, but because they'd learned something about silence, how it can either hide a wrong or make room for the truth. Inside, the corridors thrummed with a steady current of footsteps and hushed conversation. A hand-lettered sign taped to a pillar read, in thick black marker, "It shouldn't take a badge." Someone had left a single white lily at the base of it. No one claimed it. No one had to. Ethan arrived early, slipping through the side entrance with his satchel and the familiar ache in his ribs that came whenever a day asked for more than it had any right to. He wore the same charcoal jacket, the same polished but worn shoes. In a building obsessed with appearances, he took comfort in bringing the same face to both victory and regret. Linda met him near the security station, eyes scanning his face like she could read weather off a horizon. "You sure?" she asked. "No," he said, and he meant it. "But I'm here." They moved through the hall toward the chamber where the disciplinary board would deliver its recommendation and where, an hour later, the motion to discredit the witness in the McKinnon case would be argued. 2 rooms, 1 building, the same question at the root of both. What does the law look like when no one's watching it but itself? Daniel waited by the double doors, tie straight for once, palms damp against a thin folder. He looked like a man who'd chosen a road and was only now understanding its length. When he saw Ethan, he stepped forward. "I've put everything I have in this," he said, voice low. "Memos, timestamps, the access logs you flagged. If the court asks who brought it, I'll say I did." Ethan studied him. "That's going to cost you." Daniel held his gaze. "Then I'll pay." They went in together. The board read out findings in a tone that made human failure sound like punctuation. Officer conduct inconsistent with policy, implicit bias training mandated, suspension pending. Connolly stared straight ahead. Miller glanced down and stayed there. The language was measured, the outcome restrained, but it carried a weight the room could feel. There are days when institutions move like glaciers. Today, the ice cracked just enough to be heard. When it ended, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of victory. Linda touched Ethan's sleeve as the room emptied. "You don't have to stay for the next one," she said. "Yes," he said softly, looking toward the second chamber, already filling with suits and voices. "I do." They crossed the hall. The motion to discredit the witness had been packaged with care. Procedural concerns, chain of custody questions, the kind of technical precision that can walk a lie through the front door wearing Sunday clothes. The judge presiding was Evelyn Harmon, and when she took her seat, the room straightened itself without being asked. Daniel stood at counsel table, opposite a defense team with polished smiles and polished shoes. Ethan sat in the last row, the satchel at his feet. It started like most things do in this building, softly, reasonably, with the practiced choreography of objection and reply. Then the defense called for the clerk who'd handled the sealed exhibits. A woman in a gray cardigan took the stand, hands too tightly folded, eyes darting toward the ceiling as if the answer might be written in plaster. "Walk us through your access on the dates in question," the defense counsel smoothed. She did. And for a moment it sounded simple, but Daniel rose with the folder in his hand, and his voice, when it came, was not the voice Ethan had heard on the steps. It held. "Your Honor, may I approach with supplemental records?" Judge Harmon lifted a brow. "You may." Daniel set the folder on the bench and stepped back. The judge flipped through pages, logs, signatures, a pattern of late-night entries that traced a shape the room could see without being told what it was. When she looked up, the air changed. "Counsel," she said to the defense, "explain to me why your motion relies on a version of the record that omits these entries." The lawyer tried to object, to regroup. The objection died halfway to his lips. The human being inside the suit had the good sense to look ashamed. "Withdrawn," he managed. "Noted," the judge said. "Denied." The witness in the McKinnon case remained credible. It didn't make the city whole. It didn't fix the training manual, but it stopped a door from closing that might never have opened again. Ethan felt the breath leave his chest in a way that didn't hurt. He hadn't realized until that second that he'd been holding it since the morning a pair of handcuffs had tried to make his name smaller than his skin. When the proceeding ended, the room exhaled. People stood and gathered their papers. The defense slipped out first, followed by the clerk in the gray cardigan, who moved like someone walking away from a cliff's edge she hadn't known she'd been standing on. Ethan stayed seated until the last of the scrape and shuffle faded. Then he rose, took the satchel by its worn handle, and walked the aisle to the bench. Judge Harmon watched him approach with a curiosity she didn't try to hide. "Agent Cole," she said, "you're not counsel of record." "No, Your Honor," he said. "I'm delivery." He set the satchel on the ledge and unfastened the worn buckle. Inside, a slim black case lay atop the confidential folder he'd shown Rawlins. He slid the case forward, turned it so the latch faced the bench, and stepped back. The judge didn't reach for it. "What is it?" she asked. "Insurance," he said. "A copy of everything that ties Carson to the leak and the money behind it. If the Bureau gets leaned on, if the city loses its nerve, if anyone misplaces their oath, you'll still have the truth. Chain of custody's intact. Dates, signatories, off-site backups noted on the final page." She studied him for a long moment. "Why bring it to me?" "Because there are days when the law needs an honest steward," he said, "and because not every fight belongs to me." She regarded the case, then him. "This puts a target on your back." "The target wasn't exactly subtle before," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile. "Besides, I don't plan on standing still." A shadow moved in the side aisle. Daniel lingered there, watching, understanding a little more than he had that morning. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Applause would have ruined the moment the way noise ruins prayer. Linda appeared at the doorway as Ethan stepped down. "You sure you want to leave that here?" she asked under her breath. "I didn't leave it," he said. "I put it where it belongs." They walked together into the corridor. The afternoon sun had angled itself through the high windows, turning the dust in the air into glittering notes suspended on nothing. Somewhere below, on the plaza, a handful of people held signs without shouting. Ordinary faces, the kind that will never make the news, bearing witness with the quiet stubbornness this country has always depended on when the microphones go home. Connolly was there too, farther back near the stairs, out of uniform, smaller than he'd ever looked in blue. He didn't approach. He just nodded once, a thank you a man gives when the words aren't ready to arrive. Ethan returned it with the smallest lift of his chin. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Sometimes that's the bridge you can build in a day. At the doors, Daniel caught up to them. "If you ever need a statement for the record," he said, awkward, earnest, "I'll put my name on it." Ethan studied him. "Start by putting your name on the right side of the cases you already have," he said. "Then we'll talk." Daniel flushed, then nodded. "I will." "Good," Ethan said. "Make a habit out of it." They stepped into the sun together. The light felt warmer than it had in weeks. The flag above the steps loosened in a breeze that smelled faintly of rain coming in from the river. The city hummed the way it does when it's trying. Not perfect, not absolved. Trying. Linda stood with him for a moment at the top of the stairs, hands in her pockets, eyes on the crowd. "You could take a week," she said, not quite a question. "Disappear. Let the edges soften." He looked down the steps where the marble had once pressed his knees and found, to his surprise, that the memory no longer burned. It settled. It became part of the map. "I'll take a day," he said. "Maybe 2. Her mouth tilted. "Don't get decadent." He laughed, and the sound startled him with how easy it was. "I'll do my best." They started down. At the bottom, an elderly woman with a church hat and a cane touched his sleeve as he passed. "Son," she said, voice thin but strong, "you kept your head when the world tried to take it. Don't you forget that." He met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She patted his hand once and let go. He kept walking, each step the right size for the ground beneath it. At the curb, Linda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then at him. "Rawlins," she said. "He wants you back tomorrow to brief the task force." "Tell him I'll be there," Ethan said. He looked up at the courthouse, at the windows that had watched him fail and stand up on the same day. "Tell him I've got some good news for once." "What's that?" she asked. "That the witness stands," he said, "and the evidence isn't going anywhere." They stood a moment longer, letting the sun press its warm hand against their shoulders. Then Ethan turned toward the street, the city unfolding in front of him like a book he knew by heart and still loved to read. He wasn't lighter, he wasn't finished, but the weight he carried had shape now, and the road under his feet felt like something he could trust again. He adjusted the strap of his satchel. The old leather creaked as faithful as ever, and stepped into the day. Behind him, the courthouse doors swung shut with a sound that didn't feel like an ending so much as a promise that the next time a man stood on those steps with everything stacked against him, there'd be one more person ready to speak and one fewer ready to look away.